I stood at the kitchen window watching my son-in-law's car pull into the driveway, and I already knew this wasn't a social visit. It had been 5 days since we buried Margaret, and in those 5 days, I had not slept more than 3 hours at a stretch. I had forgotten to eat breakfast twice. I had stood in the shower one morning until the hot water ran out, and the cold finally pulled me back to reality. None of that mattered to the man walking up my front steps with a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. His name was Trevor, and he had married my daughter, Karen, 8 years ago, in a ceremony that Margaret had spent 14 months planning. I had walked Karen down the aisle and tried not to notice the way Trevor spent most of the reception talking to his business partner in the corner. Margaret had noticed. She always noticed. I opened the door before he knocked. "Walter." He stepped inside without waiting to be invited, which had always been his way. "I'm glad you're up." I was worried. I was 69 years old, not bedridden. "I'm up," I said. Karen came in behind him, and she at least had the decency to hug me properly, to press her face against my shoulder for a moment, the way she'd done when she was 8 years old and scared of thunderstorms. I held on a beat longer than she expected. "Dad," she said softly, "how are you doing?" "I'm managing." Trevor was already moving through the front hall toward the living room, taking in the house the way a contractor takes in a renovation project, mentally calculating, itemizing. Margaret and I had built this house ourselves, in the sense that matters we had chosen every tile, every fixture, every shade of paint. We had bought the lot in Cloverdale in 1986, when the suburb was still half farmland, and we had planted every tree in the yard with our own hands. The silver maple by the fence was older than Karen. The house was assessed at $2.4 million, and every person in my family seemed to know that number by heart, except me. I had never once thought of it as money. It was just home. We sat in the living room, the three of us. I made tea because Margaret always made tea, and I needed something to do with my hands. Karen sat on the edge of the sofa with her fingers laced together, which was what she did when she was uncomfortable. Trevor set his portfolio on the coffee table and opened it. "Walter, we want to talk to you about your situation," he said. "My situation. You're alone now, in a 4-bedroom house, on a large lot, in a neighborhood that has completely changed around you. The practical reality is that this property requires more upkeep than one person can reasonably manage." I looked at my daughter. She studied her hands. "The gutters were cleaned in September," I said. "The furnace was serviced in October. I had the roof inspected 2 years ago, and there's at least a decade of life left in it. Margaret kept a maintenance log in the kitchen drawer, if you'd like to review it." Trevor smiled the way men smile when they think you've missed the point. "This isn't about gutters, Walter. It's about the bigger picture. You're nearly 70. You're grieving. You're isolated out here. Karen worries about you constantly." Karen looked up at that, and I couldn't quite read her expression. "Your mother died 11 days ago," I said to her directly. "I'm supposed to be sad." "Of course," she said quickly. "Dad, nobody's saying—" "What we're saying," Trevor cut in, "is that there are better options available. Lifestyle communities for active seniors. Excellent ones, actually. There's a development in Langley, another in White Rock. Full amenities, medical support on site, no property headaches. And frankly, the proceeds from this house would fund a very comfortable life for a very long time." I poured the tea and said nothing for a moment. "Margaret's not cold in the ground," I said. Trevor's expression didn't change. "I know this is hard timing, Walter, but the market is strong right now, and—" "I'd like you to leave," I said. Karen stood up. "Dad." "Not you, Trevor." I looked at him calmly. "I'd like Trevor to leave. You can stay, Karen. You can have your tea, and we can talk. But I want him out of my house." The silence stretched long enough that Trevor finally closed his portfolio, stood, and walked out. The front door shut behind him with barely a sound. Karen sat back down, and we listened to his car back out of the driveway. "He means well," she said finally. "He means your inheritance," I said, not unkindly. "There's a difference." She flinched, and I felt a stab of guilt. Karen was not a bad person. She was a good person who had spent 8 years being slowly shaped by a man who measured everything in returns on investment. I had watched it happen and said too little too late. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her. "Not right now. Not while I'm still figuring out how to make a cup of coffee without automatically making 2. She started crying then, quietly, and we sat together until the tea went cold. After she left, I went upstairs to the small room at the end of the hall that Margaret had used as her office and sewing room and general refuge from the world. It smelled like her. The cedar sachets she kept in the drawer of her desk, the particular wool of the unfinished blanket still on the arm of her chair. I sat at her desk and pulled open the bottom right drawer. Margaret had shown me the envelope 3 weeks before she died, during one of the afternoons when she was still clear and alert, and characteristically direct. "Don't open it until after," she'd said, "and don't let them rush you. Promise me." I had promised. The envelope was letter-sized, cream-colored, and had my name on it in her handwriting. The handwriting of a woman who had taught grade 3 for 22 years before she retired, and still formed every letter with care. Inside were 4 items: a folded letter, a property deed, a document from our solicitor named Barbara Holloway, and a photograph. The photograph was of a lake, still water reflecting spruce trees and a strip of pale sky, a wooden dock extending from a small, rocky shore. In the distance, a red roof just visible through the trees. I turned it over. On the back, in that same careful handwriting, Lac Beauvert area, Quebec, ours. 2011. I've been saving it for you. I read the letter twice before I trusted myself to absorb it. She had bought the property in the autumn of 2011 during a trip to Quebec she had taken with her sister, Dorothy. I remembered that trip. I had stayed home to look after Karen, who was dealing with a difficult first year of marriage that neither of us talked about directly. Margaret had come back from Quebec quieter than she'd left, thoughtful in a way I hadn't pressed her on. What I hadn't known, what no one had known, was that she had used money from her father's estate to purchase a small lakefront property outside of Rivière-du-Loup. Her father had died in 2010 and left her a sum she had never mentioned to me in detail. We'd had our own finances, always, from early in our marriage, shared accounts for household expenses, separate accounts for personal savings, an arrangement that had suited us both and that we'd never had reason to revisit. The property had a cabin, 2 bedrooms, wood stove, a screened porch facing the water. She had hired a local man named Gilles to maintain it, and she had visited 4 times over the years, always when I was at our grandson's hockey tournaments or away on one of the fishing trips I took with my friend Raymond. I had not known, not once. "You always said Quebec was where you'd go if you could go anywhere," her letter read. "You said it when we were 24 years old and driving across the country, and we stopped in the Laurentians, and you stood at a lookout and said, 'This is it. This is where I'd stay.' I never forgot. I've been watching how Trevor looks at this house for 3 years. He looks at it the way a man looks at something he's decided already belongs to him. And Karen lets him, because she's tired, and because she loves him even if he's not always easy to love. I understand that. I've let things go myself over the years. But you, Walter, I will not let them manage you. You have more living to do, and you're going to do it on your own terms, not theirs. The cabin is yours. It's paid for. Gil has been paid through the end of next year, and his number is in the documents. The Cloverdale house is yours too. Do whatever you want with it, but don't let them bully you into a timeline that suits them instead of you. Barbara has all of this in order. She's been holding the deed for 2 years, waiting for me to tell her to release it to you. If you need to go, go. If you want to stay, stay. The point is that you choose. There's one more thing. Barbara has my updated will. I've left the Cloverdale house to Nathan, not to Karen. I know that's a hard thing to read, but I thought about it for a long time, and I'm asking you to trust my judgment. Nathan sees things the way we see them. He always has. Nathan was my nephew, my younger brother Edward's son. He was 26 years old and worked for a non-profit in Vancouver that restored urban green spaces. He had grown up in a small apartment with Edward, who had never had much money and had never seemed troubled by that fact. Nathan had visited us often when he was a teenager, had helped Margaret plant the vegetable garden one summer, had written her a handwritten thank you note afterward that she had kept on her bulletin board for years. At Margaret's funeral, he had arrived early, helped carry chairs, stayed to the end, and washed dishes without being asked. Karen and Trevor had left the reception early because Trevor had a conference call. I sat with Margaret's letter for a long time, in the quiet of her office. I sat until the room went dark, and I hadn't noticed because I was somewhere else entirely, back in the Laurentians at 24 years old, standing at a lookout with a woman I'd known for 8 months and already understood I would spend my life with. She had listened. All those years later, She had listened and remembered and acted. I called Barbara Holloway the next morning. She was a small, precise woman in her 60s, who had been handling our estate planning for 15 years, and who wore the same style of tortoiseshell glasses she had been wearing since we first met. She told me to come in at 2 o'clock, and when I arrived, she had everything spread across her conference table in neat, labeled folders. "Your wife was meticulous," she said, which was both accurate and an understatement. "Can they challenge the will?" "Karen can try." But the property in Quebec was purchased entirely with Margaret's separate inheritance funds and titled solely in her name before she transferred it to you. There's no marital asset argument. The Cloverdale house is more complex. It was jointly held, but Margaret's half transfers to you under the right of survivorship, which means you now own it outright. What you choose to do with it is your decision alone. What about the new will, leaving the Cloverdale house to Nathan eventually? Karen could contest it, but she'd have a poor case. Margaret was evaluated by her physician 6 months ago, specifically because she anticipated this. The evaluation confirmed full capacity. She was thorough. Barbara allowed herself a small smile. She came in without you knowing. Told me she wanted everything bulletproof. Of course she had. Trevor mentioned a competency evaluation. He said they'd spoken to a lawyer. Barbara looked at me steadily. "Walter, you have one missed phone call in your records, which you returned the same day. You're managing your finances, your home, and your own affairs. You're grieving, which is a normal human response to losing a spouse of 41 years. Those are not the same thing, and no legitimate evaluator would confuse them." I drove home a different way than usual, through the older part of Cloverdale, past the elementary school where Karen had attended and where I had volunteered for 3 years on the hot lunch program, past the community hall, where Margaret had organized the Neighborhood Emergency Preparedness Committee for 8 years, past the nursery, where we had bought the silver maple as a sapling. I stopped at the nursery. I bought a bag of bulbs, tulips, and crocuses, because the front beds needed something, and because Margaret would have already been planning the spring. The visits from Karen and Trevor resumed the following week. They were more coordinated now, more careful. Trevor did not come inside again, but Karen came alone one afternoon with a printed summary from a senior living consultant she had apparently hired. I listened to her go through it. I looked at the photographs of bright dining rooms and organized activities. "Mum's been gone for 3 weeks," I said. "I know, Dad. I know, but we have to be practical." "Practical about what, exactly?" "About the fact that I'm sleeping, eating, taking my medication, maintaining the house, seeing my friends. What is the emergency?" She faltered. "You're alone." "I'm not alone. I have Raymond. I have Dorothy. I have the neighbors. I have Nathan, who was here on Saturday helping me stack firewood." I looked at her. "I have you, if you'd like to actually visit instead of presenting slide decks." She cried again. Karen cried a great deal those weeks, which I took to mean something was working through her, even if she couldn't name it yet. Trevor escalated. He called twice, sent an email outlining what he described as a realistic timeline for asset optimization, and spoke to my brother Edward, apparently hoping Edward would add pressure. Edward called me afterward, baffled. "He wants me to convince you to sell your house," Edward said. I told him I'd sooner convince a fence post. I appreciated that. Then came the Sunday afternoon when I arrived home from a walk to find Trevor's car in my driveway, and Trevor himself standing on my porch with another man I didn't recognize. The other man had a measuring tape. I stood on the front walk and looked at them. "Trevor," I said, "get off my porch." "Walter, this is Brendan. He's a staging consultant. He was just, I didn't invite anyone onto this property. Leave. You're being unreasonable. We're trying to help you. You're standing on my property without my permission, conducting assessments I didn't authorize. That's not help. That's trespassing." I looked at Brendan. "I'm sorry you were given a false impression of the situation. I suggest you leave." Brendan left. Trevor stayed long enough to tell me that I was making things much harder than they needed to be, that Karen was exhausted, that the window for the current market wouldn't last forever. I stood at the bottom of my porch steps and let him finish. "I'm going to Quebec in 2 weeks," I said. "I'll be gone for a month to start. By the time I come back, I'd like you both to understand that my home is not available for sale, and that my decisions are not available for your input." He stared at me. "You're going to Quebec?" "I have a cabin on a lake," I said. "My wife left it to me." The expression that crossed his face, the calculation rapidly followed by the recalibration. The realization that there was an asset he hadn't known about was one I will not forget. It was clarifying in its ugliness. "How much is it worth?" he asked. "Goodbye, Trevor," I said. I called Gilles the following morning. He had a low, unhurried voice and spoke a mixture of French and English that I found immediately comfortable. He told me the cabin was in good shape, that he had repaired a section of dock the previous summer, that the wood stove had been serviced, that there was a family of loons on the lake who had been coming back for years. "Your wife," he said carefully. "She talked about you. She said you would come eventually." "She was usually right," I said. "She was a careful woman," Gilles said. "She asked me many questions about the road conditions in winter, about the nearest clinic, about the neighbors. She wanted to know everything was good before you arrived." I had to sit down for a moment after I hung up. I told Nathan about the cabin over dinner the following week. I had invited him and told him about the will, about Margaret's wishes, about the house eventually coming to him. He went very quiet. "Uncle Walter," he said, "that's I can't." "Before you object," I said, "I want to tell you what she wrote. She wrote that you see houses as homes, that you always have. She thought that mattered." He was quiet for a long time, pushing his food around his plate. Then he said, "When I was 14, I stayed here for 2 weeks in the summer while Dad was in hospital. Aunt Margaret and I planted the raised beds in the back. She let me design the layout. I stayed up half the night drawing out the plan." He looked up. "I've thought about that summer probably 100 times since." "She kept your thank you note on her bulletin board for 11 years, I said. He pressed his lips together and nodded. "There's a condition," I told him. "The beds have to stay. The vegetable beds, the roses, all of it. You can change anything else in the house, but the garden is hers. I'll expand it," he said. I drove to Quebec on a Friday in April, which Margaret would have told me was too early for reliable road conditions north of the Street Lawrence, and she would have been mostly right. I hit one patch of ice outside of Rivière-du-Loup and corrected calmly, feeling the old reflexes hold. Gilles met me at the property and walked me through everything. The cabin was small and cedar-paneled and smelled of wood smoke and cold stone. The lake was still partially frozen, silver-gray in the afternoon light, the spruce trees black against a sky that was just beginning to think about spring. A pair of mergansers moved along the open channel of water near the dock. He had left firewood stacked on the porch, groceries in the kitchen, a note on the table in careful block letters. "Bienvenue. Welcome, Gilles." I built a fire and sat in front of it for a very long time. There is a specific quality to silence near water that is different from any other silence. Margaret had known this, and had been keeping this silence in reserve for me for 13 years, tending it, maintaining it, waiting until I would need it most. I needed it. I spent the first week doing very little. I walked along the shore. I cooked simple meals. I read 2 books I had been meaning to read for years. I watched the ice break up day by day, the lake opening gradually from the center outward, the birds returning in small groups. On the 6th day, a family of loons appeared, exactly as Gilles had promised. I cried more in that first week than I had since the funeral. But it was different crying, cleaner somehow, without the background noise of pressure and expectation and other people's agendas. Just grief, doing what grief does, when you give it space. Karen called on the 9th day. I answered. "Trevor and I are separating," she said. I waited. "I've been thinking about a lot of things, about what I've let him push me into, about the way I was with you after Mum died." She was very controlled, which was how she cried now, where when she was a child she had always let it come all at once. "I'm ashamed of how I acted." "You were in a hard situation," I said. "I chose to be in it, though. I kept choosing it." A pause. "Dad, where are you?" "Sitting on a dock in Quebec," I said. "Your mother bought me a cabin on a lake." A long silence. Then a sound that was almost a laugh. "Of course she did. She saw things clearly," I said. "She always did. Can I visit?" "Not yet. When you're ready. I just want to know if that's possible." I looked out at the lake. A spruce bough dipped in the light wind coming off the water. The loons called to each other across the open water, that sound that carries everything lonesome and wild and at home all at once. "Yes," I said. "Come in June. The ice will be fully out by then, and the fishing is good." She visited in July, as it turned out, because her separation took longer to navigate than expected. She came alone, with a bag too small for more than a few days, and stood at the end of the dock for a long time before she came inside. I watched her from the porch. She had her mother's way of standing still when she was thinking hard. We had 3 days that were better than anything we'd managed in years. We fished and didn't catch much and didn't care. We drove into town for groceries, and she spoke more French than I expected. We sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about Margaret in the way I hadn't been able to with anyone else. The specific, ordinary details, the way she hummed while she cooked, the particular expressions she made when she was trying not to laugh, the way she had alphabetized her spice rack, but refused on principle to alphabetize anything else. She was preparing this place for you the whole time, Karen said one evening. All those years, she knew. She paid attention, I said. She paid attention for 41 years, and she knew what I would need even before I did. Karen was quiet. I stopped paying attention. I let Trevor set the agenda, and I went along with it. She looked at me. I told myself it was practical, that I was being realistic, but really, I just didn't want to think too hard about what I actually wanted. What do you actually want? I asked. She thought for a long time. I want to do work that matters. I've been in marketing for 15 years and I'm good at it, but I don't care about it. She shook her head. I want to figure out what I actually think instead of what's convenient to think. That's a good start, I said. It was not a quick repair. It could not be. The months after Margaret died had shown me something about Karen that I couldn't unsee, and she knew that, and we were both working with it carefully. But she came back in September, and we talked more honestly than we had in years. And that honesty, however uncomfortable, was more solid ground than anything we'd had before. Nathan moved into the Cloverdale house the following spring, into the suite in the basement, at first, while he got his bearings. He sent photographs every week, the raised beds raked and planted, the roses pruned, the tulip bulbs I'd bought in the fall coming up in the front beds right on schedule. He'd organized something he called a seed exchange in the front yard, a Sunday morning thing with neighbors bringing excess seedlings and cuttings. Mrs. Yamazaki from next door donated dahlia tubers. The family across the street brought Korean perilla and shiso. 20 people had shown up for the first one. Margaret would have been insufferably pleased. I divided my time between Quebec and Cloverdale, following the seasons the way the older people in Rivière-du-Loup did, moving when the weather moved, staying put when the lake was at its best. Gilles and I had become genuine friends. He taught me to ice fish in the first winter, which I had thought would be miserable and turned out to be extraordinarily peaceful, sitting in a small hut on the frozen lake, watching the line and talking about nothing urgent. I had found a retired woodworking teacher in town named Fernand, who ran informal sessions out of his garage on Tuesday mornings, and who had the particular gift of making you feel capable just by showing you the right way to hold a tool. I built a simple table, then a bench, then a set of shelves for the cabin. My hands, which had spent 40 years managing spreadsheets and committee meetings, discovered that they knew how to make things. It was a revelation at 69. It felt like finding a room in a house you'd lived in all your life. On the first anniversary of Margaret's death, I was at the cabin. Karen drove up the night before, and Nathan took the train from Montreal where he was attending a conference, and Dorothy came with her husband Robert, and Gilles came with a bottle of local cider, and we sat on the porch as the sun went down over the water. I had Margaret's last letter with me. Barbara had kept it sealed and mailed it to me with instructions to open it on the anniversary. My dear Walter, if you're reading this at the lake, I'm glad. If you're reading it somewhere else, that's fine too. You always found your own way to things, even when you pretended you needed directions. I want you to know that I wasn't afraid when I was planning all of this. I was practical, which is different. I wanted to know that you'd be all right, and I couldn't know that unless I did something about it. You know how I am. I hope you've been building things. I hope you've been outside. I hope you've found people who are worth your time, and that you haven't let grief talk you out of being exactly who you are. I want to say something about Karen. She's not a bad person. She got lost for a while in a life that didn't fit her, and she made some choices I found hard to forgive. But she's my daughter, and I think she can find her way back if she's given the room to do it. I'm asking you to give her that room when you're ready. Not because she deserves it immediately, but because you will both be better for it in the long run. You're good at that. You're better at it than you think. As for the rest, you have more time than you believe you do. Don't waste it being afraid of needing help someday. Use it. Go somewhere. Build something. Learn something you've been putting off. 70 isn't an end. It's just a different kind of beginning. And you have always been better at beginnings than you've given yourself credit for. I loved our life, Walter. All of it. Even the hard parts, because the hard parts were with you. Now go make something new. All my love, Margaret. I read it aloud to everyone on the porch. The sun was down by the time I finished, and the first stars were out over the water. Nobody said anything for a while, which was exactly right. Karen reached over and took my hand. Later, after everyone had turned in, I sat alone with the last of the cider and watched the loons settle on the water for the night. Somewhere in the tree line, an owl called once and was quiet. I thought about what Margaret had written. 70 isn't an end. She had been 58 when she bought this property. She had driven up here alone 4 times in 13 years, had walked this shore, had sat on this dock, had planned and tended and prepared, all without once letting it show. She had held this in reserve with the patience of a person who knows that certain things take their time. There are things I know now that I wish I had understood earlier, things I would say to anyone sitting where I sat in those first terrible weeks after the funeral, when the grief and the pressure and the fear all arrive together, and it becomes hard to tell them apart. Grief is not incompetence. Being sad is not the same as being incapable. The people who love you will wait while you find your footing. The people who can't wait were never really waiting for you. Your home is yours. Your time is yours. Your choices are yours. No one is entitled to your autonomy just because they share your blood, or because the market happens to be strong right now, or because their own ambitions require your cooperation. And this, if someone in your life has been paying attention, really paying attention, the way a person does when they love you without agenda, listen to what they've been trying to tell you. The evidence of that attention is sometimes not visible until you most need it. Margaret paid attention for 41 years. She left me the proof in a cedar-paneled cabin on a lake in Quebec, in a photograph tucked in an envelope in the bottom drawer of her desk, in a deed prepared in 2011 and held by a solicitor who wore tortoiseshell glasses and said, "Your wife was meticulous." She was. She was meticulous and clear-eyed, and she loved me enough to plan for a future she wouldn't be in, which is the most specific and difficult kind of love there is. I am 70 years old. I wake up most mornings to the sound of water and birds. I build things with my hands. I have a daughter who is slowly becoming someone I recognize again. I have a nephew who is growing tomatoes in a garden that belonged to his aunt, and who sends me photographs of the results as though reporting to someone who needs to know. He is. She does. Not every story ends cleanly. Wounds like the ones those months left don't disappear. They just become part of the texture of a life, the way scar tissue does. Some mornings I reach for a second coffee cup before I remember. Some evenings the porch feels too quiet. Some days the grief arrives without warning and I sit with it until it passes, which it always does. But I chose this. I chose this lake and this cabin and this particular quality of silence. I chose to stay in my own life on my own terms, rather than be managed into a version of it that suited everyone else. I chose to trust what Margaret built for me when she was still strong enough to build it. That choice is the thing I would most want someone else to hear, if they're in the middle of what I was in the middle of. You are allowed to choose. No matter how loud the pressure gets, no matter how many brochures appear on your coffee table, no matter how many times someone frames your grief as evidence of your decline, you are allowed to choose. Margaret would say, "I'm being preachy." She'd say it with that expression she had, the one that meant she was right, but she was going to let me finish anyway. She was right, of course. She usually was. But I'm going to keep saying it, because she's not here to say it herself, and someone should.